on a hillside above the village of Pranjani, Serbia, a signal fire cracked and threw orange light against the pines. It was just past midnight on August 2, 1944. Overhead, an engine grew louder, then closer until it became unmistakable. The deep, steady drone of a Douglas C-47 transport. Villagers in sheepskin caps and homespun wool coats stood shoulder to shoulder with gaunt young Americans in torn flight jackets. No one spoke. Below, in a stone sheepfold, bells clinked faintly, as if the whole valley itself was holding its breath. Every eye followed the dark shape circling low over the trees. Months later, one of the young airmen waiting in that darkness would try to describe what it felt like when the rescue planes finally arrived. Lieutenant Oliver put it simply, it was a tremendous thrill to see them coming in. That thrill was still far off. First, this story had to survive months of hiding and 60 years of official silence. This is the story of more than 500 Allied airmen who vanished into the mountains of Nazi-occupied Serbia in 1944, sheltered village by farmers who had almost nothing to give and everything to lose. It has nearly disappeared from the history books. Months before that signal fire, Lieutenant Oliver's hands gripped a torn parachute harness as black bursts of flak bloomed across the sky over the Ploesti oil fields, his B-24 falling out of formation, smoke pouring from an engine, and every choice narrowing down to a single silk canopy and open air. By the summer of 1944, the war in the skies over southeastern Europe had a single brutal center of gravity: the oil refineries at Ploesti, Romania. The U.S. 15th Air Force flew wave after wave of B-24 Liberators against those refineries, and the most direct path from their bases in Italy carried them straight over German-occupied Serbia. Flak batteries and fighter squadrons waited along that corridor. Over the course of the campaign, the 15th Air Force lost roughly 350 bombers in the skies above the region, and for every downed crew, the mountains below became either a grave or a hiding place. The route to Ploesti ran over rugged country, pine ridges, limestone gorges, and scattered farm villages with no roads wide enough for a truck. Crews called it flying into a shooting gallery with no way to turn back once the bomb run began. A hit engine, a burning wing, a crew bailing out into thin, cold air above unfamiliar mountains. These were not rare stories by 1944. They were Tuesday. What waited for a downed airman on the ground depended entirely on which village found him first and what that village decided to risk. Lieutenant Oliver was, by most accounts, an unremarkable young man before the war. A bombardier from the American Midwest, the kind of quiet, careful flyer who checked and rechecked his instruments before every run. He had grown up in farm country, in a house where nobody talked much and everybody worked. By the summer of 1944, he had flown a string of missions out of southern Italy, each one adding a little more gray to a face barely out of its 20s, each one taking off from the same runway and climbing north over the Adriatic toward Romania and its burning refineries. 200 miles north and east, in the hill country of Ravna Gora, a farmer named Petar split wood outside a house that had stood for 3 generations. He was in his 40s, weathered, with a heavy dark mustache and a sheepskin cap he wore in every season but summer. Petar was no soldier by trade, but he had joined the Chetnik militia loyal to General Draža Mihailović, the officer leading Yugoslavia's royalist resistance against the German occupation. Like most men in his valley, Petar kept one foot in the fields and one foot in the war, because by 1944 there was no longer a way to keep them apart. Life in Petar's village ran on old rhythms even under occupation. Sheep moved down from the high pastures at dusk, their bells clattering against the evening quiet. Wood smoke hung low over the rooftops, thick with the smell of boiled cabbage and strong tobacco. Behind a loose stone in one cellar wall, a hidden radio crackled with news the Germans did not want heard, reports of Allied advances, whispered in a code half the village had learned to read by the tone of a neighbor's face. Everyone knew where the radio was. Nobody said its location out loud, not even at home. Before every mission, Lieutenant Oliver performed the same small ritual. He would reach down, press 2 fingers against the top of his right boot, and feel the outline of a photograph folded there, a face soft at the edges from months of handling. He had never shown it to his crewmates, and none of them had ever asked. In a war fought mostly with instruments and numbers, altitude, airspeed, bomb run headings, it was the one thing Oliver carried that could not be calculated. He kept it there through takeoff, through the bomb run, and through whatever came after. Petar carried a knife that had belonged to his father, its handle worn smooth and dark from 40 years of use before it ever reached his own belt. His father had used it for skinning game and cutting rope. Petar used it for the same ordinary chores, splitting kindling, slicing bread, cutting the twine on a hay bale. It was not a weapon in any sense that mattered, not against a German patrol carrying rifles. But he wore it every day, the way another man might wear a wedding ring, a small, constant reminder of where he came from and what he still owed his family's name. German occupation orders were blunt on the subject of downed Allied airmen. Villages caught sheltering them faced collective punishment, and in parts of occupied Yugoslavia that punishment had already meant burned homes and executed civilians. Petar's neighbors knew the risk in specific personal terms, not abstract ones, and still, when an American parachute came down over a Ravnogora ridge, the choice most villagers made took less than a minute. It was not politics, mostly. It was an old mountain code of hospitality toward a stranger in trouble, and a belief, spoken often in that region, that a guest under your roof was under your protection, whatever the cost. By the last week of July 1944, Lieutenant Oliver had flown 11 missions to Ploesti and back without serious damage to his aircraft. Petar had spent that same week helping 2 other Ravnogora families dig a second hiding cellar, on the quiet assumption that more Americans were coming, whether anyone wanted them to or not. Neither man knew the other existed, neither had any reason to. But the flight path from Italy to the Ploesti refineries ran directly over Petar's valley, and the numbers, cold and simple, said it was only a matter of time before one more B-24 did not make it home. On the morning of the 29th of July, 1944, Lieutenant Oliver's B-24 leveled off at 21,000 feet on the run toward the Ploesti refineries, its bomb bay doors already open. The flak came up thick and black, bursting in ragged clusters ahead of the formation. A shell fragment tore through the No. 3 engine and set it burning. The pilot held formation for 11 seconds, counting off the bomb run by habit, before the fire spread into the wing, and he gave the order every man on that crew had rehearsed 100 times and hoped never to hear. Oliver went out the bomb bay at 18,000 feet, the wind tearing the breath out of him before the chute even opened. He watched his own airplane fall away below, trailing black smoke, and counted the other chutes blooming white against the gray sky, 4, then 5. The ground came up fast, pine ridges and terraced fields he did not recognize. He landed hard in a plowed field outside Ravnogora, rolled once, and lay still for a moment listening for engines, for dogs, for anything that would tell him whether he had landed among friends or enemies. A boy tending goats on the ridge above the field saw the parachute come down and ran for the village before Oliver had finished gathering the silk into his arms. Within 20 minutes, 3 men were at the field, Petar among them, moving fast and speaking low. They did not ask his name first. They asked whether he could walk. A German patrol was known to work that valley road twice a day, and the gap between finding an airman and hiding him was measured in minutes, not hours. They had him off the open ground and into a stand of trees before the goats had finished scattering. For the next several days, Oliver moved from house to house after dark, never sleeping under the same roof twice, always led by someone new. Petar carried him the 3rd night, along a route he had walked since boyhood, using no light. Folded inside his coat was a hand-drawn map of the district, ridge lines and stream crossings, and the names of families who could be trusted, the markings deliberately rough, unreadable to anyone who had not made them. He had started the map months earlier, before Oliver, before any of the Americans, certain the day would come when he would need it. By the 2nd week of August, word of Oliver, and of dozens like him, had reached Allied headquarters in Bari, Italy, carried by scattered radio signals and second-hand reports out of the Serbian hills. The 15th Air Force was losing bombers over the Ploesti route at a rate that alarmed even hardened planners, and every loss meant more parachutes, more strangers landing in fields they had never seen, more villages taking on a danger they had not asked for. Somewhere between 200 and 300 airmen were now believed to be hiding in Chetnik territory. Bari needed a way in. Just after midnight on the 3rd of August 1944, a lone C-47 crossed into Yugoslav airspace low and dark, no lights showing. Below, villagers at Pranjani had lit a signal fire in a field called Galavica Polje, the flames the only marker for a pilot navigating blacked-out mountains by dead reckoning. 3 men stood in the open cargo door: Captain George Musulin, Master Sergeant Michael Rajasic, and Navy radioman Arthur Jibilian, radio gear strapped across his back in heavy canvas. It was the mission's 7th attempt to get a team on the ground. This time, the wind was right. The 3 parachutes opened almost together, drifting down toward the fire, and the dark shapes of men gathered around it. Jibilian hit the ground hardest, the radio set driving his shoulder into the dirt, and for a moment he lay still, listening to Serbian voices he could not understand closing in around him. Then hands were pulling him up, and someone was laughing, and Musulin, on his feet already and unmistakably enormous in the firelight, was shaking hands with a Chetnik officer as if they were old friends meeting at a train station instead of 2 armies improvising a rescue in the dark. Within days, Musulin had a rough head count. Airmen scattered across a dozen villages, some hidden for weeks, some only days, all of them thin, most of them in civilian coats donated by families who had little enough of their own. He sent word through the valley that any American or Allied airman within reach should make his way to Pranjani. They came in 2s and 3s, on foot, on borrowed carts, escorted by villagers who had kept them alive without ever expecting a reward for it. By the 2nd week of August, close to 250 men were camped in and around the fields near Pranjani. There was no airstrip. There was a long stretch of pasture, uneven, studded with trees, cut through by low stone walls that had stood for generations. Musulin walked it once with a Chetnik commander, paced off roughly 700 yards, and gave the order to clear it starting that afternoon. Airmen who had not held a tool heavier than a machine gun in months picked up axes and shovels borrowed from farmhouses for miles around. Villagers worked beside them, Petar among them, his father's knife put to use for the first time on something other than bread and kindling, cutting root and rope alike. It was brutal, unglamorous labor, done mostly in silence because so few of the men shared a language. Trees came down one at a drag by ropes and by hand. Stones the size of ammunition crates were levered out of the ground and rolled to the field's edge. By the 2nd day, hands on both sides were raw and bleeding, wrapped in whatever cloth could be spared. Nobody complained aloud, not the Serbian farmers missing a harvest they could not afford to lose, and not the American flyers who understood, without needing to be told, that this field was the only road home any of them had left. Every night, Jibilian carried his radio into a barn or a cellar and worked the key by lamplight, tapping out coded traffic to Bari, listening through static for a reply that might not come for hours. He reported numbers of airmen, the field's progress, the growing German patrol activity along the valley road. Each transmission carried real risk. German direction-finding units were known to hunt for exactly this kind of signal. He kept the sessions short on principle and long on necessity because 250 men waiting in the hills needed Bari to believe them, and believing required proof. In Bari, not everyone believed the numbers, and fewer still wanted to risk aircraft over territory held by Draža Mihailović, whose forces the British had already broken with. OSS Chief General William Donovan pressed the case to Washington in blunt terms, later recounted by men close to the decision. "Screw the British! Let's get our boys out!" Whatever the exact words, the sentiment carried. The order to fly the mission went forward over London's objections, and 250 stranded airmen stopped being a diplomatic problem and became a rescue. The friction was not new. British intelligence had backed Mihailović's rival, Josip Broz Tito, for more than a year, and any American operation that armed or even fed the Chetniks risked unraveling that alliance. Officers in Bari argued for days over how much support Musulin's team could openly give, and whether wounded Chetnik fighters could be flown out alongside American airmen when the planes finally came. Nobody in that argument was in the field near Pranjani, watching men clear rocks with their bare hands and wait for an airplane that London, if it could, would rather not send. The clearest evidence of how high the British objection reached survives in a telegram passed down through Franklin Roosevelt's own channel, blocking the mission's chief planner, George Vujnović, from personally leading the team into Mihailović's headquarters. It read simply, "Former naval person objects to George Vujnović going into Mihailović's headquarters. Therefore he will not be sent." Churchill himself, unnamed but unmistakable, had reached across an ocean to keep one man off a single airplane. None of that reached Pranjani in time to slow the work. Musulin kept sending Chetnik couriers on foot and horseback between villages and outlying camps, carrying coded slips of paper to relay confirmations back to the radio, since Jibilyan's transmitter could not reach every scattered pocket of hiding airmen directly. The couriers moved at night on trails only men like Petar truly knew, crossing roads the Germans patrolled on a schedule that was mostly but not always predictable. It was a slow, deliberate, dangerous work done by men whose names would not appear in any American after-action report. On the night of the 8th of August, one of those couriers, a young Chetnik fighter carrying confirmation codes toward a relay point outside Pranjani, did not arrive. His body was found the next morning near a crossroads the patrols were known to favor. He had been carrying nothing that identified him as part of the operation, and the Germans, as far as anyone could tell, never learned what he had died protecting. Musulin recorded the loss in 3 flat lines in his own notes. It was the mission's first cost, and everyone building that airstrip understood it would not be the last. For 3 nights running, Sergeant Jibilyan had knelt over his radio set in a farmhouse outside Pranjani, running the antenna wire up through a hayloft window, and getting nothing back but static. The Serbian hills swallowed weak signals, and Bari was nearly 600 miles away. On the 4th night he tried a different frequency, borrowed from a chart Rajasic kept folded in his boot, and a voice cut through the noise asking him to repeat. Jibilyan read off the coordinates for a hand-cleared field near Pranjani twice, slowly, the way he had been trained. Bari read them back correctly. The airstrip finally had a use. Word of the stranded airmen reached General William Donovan, the OSS chief in Washington, who had little patience for London's objections to a Chetnik-run rescue. Airman accounts and later histories credit him with a blunt reply to the British complaints. "Screw the British. Let's get our boys out." Whether or not Donovan used those exact words in that room, the effect was the same. Within days, Bari had authorization to fly. By the 2nd week of August, the field outside Pranjani had gone from pasture to airstrip, 700 yards of packed earth cleared by hand. Airmen who could still walk worked beside farmers and Chetnik fighters, hauling stones and felling saplings from first light until dusk. Half the men swinging axes had never held one before the war. German patrols moved through the valley below on a schedule the villagers had learned to read, and every work party kept one man watching the road. No shovel or axe made a sound after the church bell in the next village rang 6. On the night of the 10th, a boy no older than 15, the nephew of a farmer sheltering 2 airmen, walked 4 miles across open pasture to reach the camp before dawn. He had seen truck headlights on the Valjevo road and counted 11 vehicles moving toward Pranjani. Musulin woke the camp without lighting a single lamp. Airmen and their hosts scattered into the tree line before sunrise, and the column, as it turned out, passed 6 miles wide of the valley. Musulin later said the mission came closer to disaster that night than at any other point in the operation. Through the last weeks of summer and into the first cold nights of fall, the airmen waited on rations that would have been thin even by the standards of a poor Serbian household. Cornmeal mush, a little cheese, bread stretched with chaff when flour ran short. Villagers who had almost nothing themselves still split what they had into smaller portions rather than turn a hungry stranger away. Lieutenant Oliver later remembered counting the days not by a calendar, but by how many times the same field had gone from green to frost. By then, hunger had become simply another weather condition to plan around. At night, when the risk of German patrols eased, small groups gathered in barns and root cellars to pass around what was left of a single pack of cigarettes, one man taking 2 draws before handing it to the next. Airmen from Ohio and Texas and California traded stories about home with villagers who spoke almost no English, using hand gestures and the few words each side had picked up from the other. It was not much. For men who had spent weeks certain they would die in these hills, it was enough to get through until morning. Some nights that was the whole of the war. By late September, Lieutenant Oliver had been hiding for more than 2 months, and the weight had gone out of him along with his uniform. He had stopped believing, some nights, that any airplane was coming. Petar found him sitting alone outside a hay barn well past curfew, turned the small photograph he kept in his boot over in his hands without a word, and Petar sat down beside him and stayed until Oliver went back inside. It was, by most accounts, the closest he came to giving up. Nothing more was said that night that either man later chose to repeat. When a German patrol swept through Petar's village without warning in early October, his wife hid 3 American airmen in a root cellar beneath the kitchen floor, sealed under a rug and a table leg jammed against the trapdoor. Soldiers searched the house for the better part of an hour, close enough that the airmen could hear boots on the floorboards above them. Petar's wife served the patrol what coffee substitute she had, answered their questions in short sentences, and did not once glance toward the rug. It was, she said afterward, the longest hour of her life. Food was scarce enough that a single pot of soup, mostly potato and whatever herbs grew wild that week, might be passed among 6 or 8 men, with 1 spoon between them. Nobody complained about the arrangement, and nobody took more than his turn. An airman from a bomber crew out of Foggia later said the soup was thinner than anything he had eaten in his life, and that he had never been more grateful for a meal. Sharing what little there was had become its own kind of discipline. Even at its thinnest, no one at that table ever ate before the airmen did. On a Sunday in late October, a handful of airmen gathered with Petar's family in the loft above the barn and sang a hymn low enough not to carry past the walls. None of the villagers understood the English words, but they recognized the melody from church, and a few hummed along under their breath. It lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Afterward, nobody spoke about it, and the men went back to watching the road, but something in the barn had loosened for a little while. Petar later said it was the only hymn he ever learned by heart in a language not his own. During the day, when it was safe to sit outside, one of the younger airmen took to teaching Petar's children simple English words, pointing at a chicken, a well, a pair of boots, and waiting for the children to repeat them back. The children taught him Serbian words in return, correcting his pronunciation with the blunt honesty only children have. It became a small ritual of the waiting, 10 minutes a day that belonged to no army and no war, just a man and 2 children trading words across a language neither fully owned. Neither side kept score. As October wore into November, the nights turned sharply colder, and the airmen who had been hiding since summer began wearing whatever the villagers could spare. A mismatched wool coat here, a pair of socks there, layered over uniforms gone thin at the elbows and knees. Frost formed on the inside of barn windows some mornings. Word had come through Jibilian's radio that more flights were planned, but no date had been fixed, and waiting for a date that kept slipping was its own kind of cold. Some men counted flights that never came the way others counted sheep. Twice in November, German search parties came close enough to hear dogs in the distance, and both times the airmen scattered into ravines or under hay without being told twice. Neither search turned up a single hidden man. Villagers later said, the dogs seemed to lose the scent in the smoke of chimney fires that the women kept burning on purpose, a detail nobody had planned in advance but that everyone quietly understood the value of afterward. One woman later joked that she had burned more firewood keeping Americans alive than she had in the 10 winters before the war combined. Some nights, when there was nothing else to do, Oliver wrote in a small notebook a farmer's daughter had given him, short lines about home that he did not expect anyone but himself to read. He wrote about his mother's kitchen, about a dog he had left behind, about the photograph in his boot. He never mentioned the war in those pages. It was as if keeping one corner of his mind untouched by Serbia and Germany both was the only way he knew to hold on to who he had been before any of this started. The notebook survived the war. The war in those pages barely existed. By the last week of November, more than 100 airmen were scattered across farms and cellars within a day's walk of Pranjani, waiting on flights that had not yet been scheduled. Petar's hunting knife, his father's before him, had by then been used to cut rope, whittle tent stakes, and once to pry open a jammed door during a night search, more tool than weapon in those months. Whatever came next, the villagers had already given something no ledger in Washington would ever fully record. Nobody in that valley called it heroism. They called it Tuesday and then Wednesday and kept going. Word finally came in the first days of August. The planes were coming back to Pranjani, and this time in real numbers. Villagers, airmen, and Chetnik fighters returned together to the long meadow known as Galovica Polja, and finished what they had started weeks earlier, dragging out roots and rock with shovels, axes, and bare hands until the strip ran nearly 700 yards end to end. Blisters split open, and nobody stopped long enough to bandage them. By the 9th of August, the field was ready, and so, after months of waiting under other men's roofs, was Pranjani itself. That night, villagers laid the signal fires exactly as Musulin had shown them weeks before, based in a pattern only a friendly aircraft would recognize from the air. Word passed farm to farm to keep the dogs quiet and every lantern dark except along the field itself. Around midnight, women who had spent months hiding strangers under haystacks and loose floorboards stood at the tree line watching the sky instead, listening for engines that might never come, or might come with the wrong markings painted on their wings. The sound reached them first, low and steady, growing until it filled the whole valley. Then came the shape, a Douglas C-47 dropping out of the dark toward the fires, engines throttled back, landing gear reaching for ground that had been a wheat field a season earlier. It touched down hard on the packed dirt of Galovica Polje, bounced once, and rolled to a stop near the tree line. For a few seconds, nobody on the ground moved. Then the whole field ran forward together, toward the open cargo door. Lieutenant Oliver had waited 96 days. From the morning his B-24 went down in flak to the night the transports finally came for him. Years afterward he tried to put that sound into words, and settled for the plainest ones he had. It was a tremendous thrill to see them coming in. He said it the way a man describes something he still could not quite believe he had lived long enough to see. Musulin worked the loading line like a foreman running a factory floor, calling names off a list by flashlight, waving men toward the open doors 2 and 3 at a time. More C-47s followed the first, engines idling on the wet grass while fighters circled the ridgeline overhead, watching for anything carrying a German cross on its wings. Nobody who stood in that field forgot the sight of him, a broad shoulder cut black against the dark, keeping the whole operation moving with a calm that steadied exhausted, half-disbelieving men. By sunrise on the 10th of August, roughly 240 airmen had been loaded aboard the transports and lifted off the meadow at Pranjani, bound for the Allied airfield at Bari, Italy, 400 miles across the Adriatic Sea. Not one plane was lost taking off from that field that night, and not one airman who reached the strip in time was left standing on it. For a rescue built from nothing but radios, farmhouses, and months of villagers keeping their mouths shut, it was close to unbelievable, and every exhausted man aboard knew exactly how much luck and how many quiet villagers had made it possible. Oliver climbed the short metal ladder into the crowded cabin of a C-47, with his flight jacket torn at both elbows and the small creased photograph still tucked inside his boot, exactly where it had ridden through every farmhouse, hayloft, and root cellar of the last 3 months. He had carried it as a private promise that he would get home to show it to someone. As the engines wound up under his feet, he pressed one hand flat against his boot, just to be certain it was still there. Peter stood at the edge of the field as the transports taxied for takeoff, his father's hunting knife still on his belt, the same blade that had cut rope, whittled tent stakes, and once pried open a jammed door on a night when German patrols were close enough to hear the dogs. He did not wave his hat the way some of the other villagers did. He simply raised one hand, flat and still, and held it there until the last plane lifted off the meadow and turned west toward the sea. More flights followed on the 12th, the 15th, and the 18th of August, each one landing at Pranjani after dark and gone again before the sky turned gray. Roughly 210 additional airmen went out on those later runs, men who had spent the summer in barns and root cellars scattered across the valley. Villagers who had sheltered strangers for months now stood at their gates at 3 in the morning to watch trucks carry them off toward the airstrip, some of them crying, most simply too tired for tears. None of it moved without Jubilian. Night after night he sat hunched over his radio set, encoding weather reports, head counts, and grid coordinates by hand, then transmitting them to Barry on schedules timed to the minute. A missed message could mean a plane turning back over open country with German fighters nearby, or a field full of airmen with no aircraft coming at all. He rarely slept more than a few hours between transmissions, and every flight that landed safely at Pranjani had passed through his hands first. The rescue came with a political cost that surfaced within weeks. Along with the airmen, several wounded Chetnik fighters had been loaded onto outbound planes, men who had helped guard the strip and had no other way to reach a hospital. In Bari, British officers who viewed Mihailovic's forces as a liability to Allied strategy objected loudly, and a decision made on a dark airfield in Serbia became a problem far larger than the exhausted, half-frozen men who made it had ever intended it to be. Musulin never explained his decisions to the villagers who had trusted him with their son's safety and their own. Airman Richard Fellman remembered him from that first night at Pranjani. The way his size alone had steadied a field of frightened, exhausted men. The one who was in the lead was one of the biggest chaps I'd ever seen. Within weeks of that night, the man Fellman described would be gone, ordered back to Bari over a choice he never said he regretted. By the last week of August, Musulin was recalled to headquarters in Bari, and command of the mission passed to Lieutenant Nick Lalic, a Serbian-American officer and former college basketball player who had never expected to run a rescue operation out of a mountain farmhouse. The villagers who had come to know Musulin by name and by the sound of his boots on the road learned, as they had learned everything else that year, to trust the next stranger the Americans sent, and to keep the signal fires ready whenever he asked. The airmen kept coming out through the fall. A new strip was cut at Koseljeva in 3 days of September labor, lifting out about 20 more men before partisan and Soviet advances pushed the operation east. By late October, a third strip had been hacked out of frozen ground near Boljanic, and roughly 15 airmen went out on its first flight in early November, their boots crunching on iced dirt where villagers only weeks earlier had still been bringing in the last of the harvest. On December 27, 1944, the last C-47 climbed off the frozen strip at Boljanic, carrying the final airmen and the last members of the OSS team who had run the mission since August. Behind them lay nearly a year of villages that had fed strangers, hidden them in barns and haylofts, and kept quiet about it under German patrols. By the time the engines faded over the mountains, 512 Allied personnel had been flown out of occupied Serbia, 432 Americans and 80 more from Britain, France, Italy, and beyond. Not one airman and not one aircraft had been lost in the airlift itself. General Draža Mihailović never left Serbia. As Tito's partisans and the Soviet Red Army swept through the country, the Chetnik commander who had ordered his people to shelter every downed American stayed put. The new communist government arrested him, tried him as a wartime collaborator and traitor, and executed him by firing squad in Belgrade in July 1940. The same man whose villagers had hidden Lieutenant Oliver fed the airmen and cleared 3 airstrips by hand for men they never expected to meet again. By most accounts, when Allied officers offered to fly Mihailović out ahead of the advancing partisans, he refused. "I prefer to lose my life in my country than to live as an outcast in a strange land." He got his wish. What he could not know was that his country's new government would spend the next 50 years making sure America stayed quiet about him too. President Truman signed a secret Legion of Merit for Mihailović in 1948, the highest honor the United States could give a foreign soldier. The citation stayed classified, filed away where the State Department wanted it, out of sight of a Cold War Belgrade that had branded him a war criminal. Richard Fellman, one of the airmen who owed Mihailović his life, spent decades trying to get that story told. He lobbied Congress for a memorial on Capitol Hill, working with senators who remembered the war, and for just as many years the State Department turned him down, unwilling to reopen a wound with a communist ally against the Soviets. In the small town where Petar had once handed over a hand-drawn field map to men who could barely read the roads themselves, nothing marked what had happened there. His father's hunting knife stayed on his belt for the rest of his life, and the debt he was owed was never written down anywhere an American could find it. The OSS records on Operation Halyard stayed sealed until 1997. For more than 50 years, the villages that had risked everything for strangers in flight jackets remained a line in a classified file, not a chapter in anyone's history book. Today at dawn, a small stone memorial stands in the hills above Pranjani, catching the same soft light that once guided a C-47 down onto a hand-cleared strip. Visitors are few, mostly family retracing a story their grandfathers only started telling near the end of their lives. Had you ever heard of Operation Halyard, one of the largest air rescues of Allied personnel from behind enemy lines in American history? Lieutenant Oliver kept his photograph, Petar kept his father's knife, and a village in Serbia kept its promise, long after anyone in Washington remembered to say thank you. Musulin went back into the shadows he already knew. In 1950, he joined the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency and spent the next 2 decades working anti-Castro operations out of Miami. The same coolness that had gotten 3 men off a mountainside in Serbia now aimed at a different enemy. He retired in 1974, and when he died in 1987 at age 72, his obituary mentioned Yugoslavia only in passing, a single sentence buried beneath a career the government still would not fully explain. Arthur Jabilian carried the radio that had called in every one of those C-47s, and after the war he carried the silence too. He worked in Ohio, raised a family, and did not talk much about Pranjani. It took until 2008, when the Department of Defense finally recognized the mission's radio men, for him to receive public credit for the transmissions that had once meant the difference between rescue and nothing. He died in 2010 at 86 and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery under a stone that says nothing about a mountain airstrip in Serbia. George Vujnović had planned the whole operation from a desk in Bari and had never been allowed to set foot in Serbia himself, blocked by a British objection that reached all the way to Winston Churchill. He kept the OSS secrecy oath for 66 years, saying almost nothing to his own children about what he had built. Only in October 2010, after receiving a Bronze Star at age 95, did he finally sit for interviews. He died in 2012 in Queens, New York, 96 years old, one of the last men alive who remembered every name on the manifest. Nick Lalich, the college basketball player who had commanded the mission's final months, went home to Ohio and mostly stayed there. He had signed the orders for that last flight out of Boljanic in December 1944. 20 airmen and a radio team lifted off a frozen strip in the snow, and then he closed the file on it the way the OSS asked every one of its officers to. For most of his life, his own neighbors did not know he had run a rescue larger than almost any other in the war. Why did it take 50 years for any of this to reach a history book? Part of the answer is simple paperwork. The OSS records on Operation Halyard stayed classified until 1997. Part of it is politics. Tito's communist Yugoslavia branded Mihailović a war criminal and a Nazi collaborator, and acknowledging a debt to him meant embarrassing a Cold War partner Washington needed against Moscow. So the file stayed sealed, and the men who owed him their lives were told, more than once, that now was not the time. Richard Fellman never let it go. He lobbied Congress for decades, working alongside Senators Strom Thurmond and Barry Goldwater, pushing for a memorial on Capitol Hill that the State Department blocked again and again. He wrote a memoir, Mihailović and I, and organized the surviving airmen into an association that met every year, fewer of them each time, to make sure Pranjani was not forgotten just because Washington found it inconvenient to remember. In 1948, President Truman had quietly signed the Legion of Merit for Mihailović, the United States' highest honor for a foreign soldier, and then let it sit in a State Department drawer for 57 years. It was not until 2005 that the citation was finally handed to his daughter, Gordana, in a small ceremony far removed from the mountain where it had been earned. By then, almost none of the villagers who had built that first airstrip with hand tools were still alive to see it. Today, the memorial above Pranjani is small and easy to miss if you are not looking for it. A stone marker in a field that once had to be cleared of tree stumps in the dark by farmers who had never met an American. No plaque lists all 512 names, no highway sign points the way. What is left instead is what was always there. A village that decided, without being asked twice, to feed and hide and bury the risk for men who had fallen out of the skies speaking a language most of them barely understood. Had you ever heard of Operation Halyard before tonight? One of the largest rescues of Allied airmen from behind enemy lines in American history, carried out not by an army but by farmers with hunting knives and hand-cleared fields. Lieutenant Oliver kept his photograph. Petar kept his father's knife. Richard Fellman kept fighting for a memorial almost nobody in Washington wanted to build, and a village in the hills of Serbia kept its promise, long after anyone in power remembered to say thank you.